I think that's one of the things that first drew me to the kind of research I was doing. It was obvious to me that community was not disappearing as rapidly in Japan as people might assume, and I was curious to find out why.
An associate professor of anthropology at Columbia University, Dr. Theodore Bestor is the author of Neighborhood Tokyo. This prize-winning book offers a portrait of life in a little area of mom-and-pop stores and small family businesses located just to the south of the heart of Tokyo. Today, he talks with anthropologist David W. Plath about how he conducted his study of the neighborhood and its people, and how he wrote his book about them.
Why did you end up in this little place called Miyamoto-cho? It sounds like you were looking for the traditional community.
Well, in a sense, I was looking for the traditional community. I had I suppose, an ethnographic sense of what the range of communities was like in Tokyo. And in trying to pick a neighborhood for this research, I tried to the best of my ability to avoid either extreme. I tried to find a neighborhood that was not so ancient, so venerable that people would say, well, when Ieyasu entered Edo in 1590,
he slept here.
His first night.
Yeah.
And ever since then, we've had this festival in honor of him. Yeah. And on the other hand, I tried to avoid a place where everybody had just moved in yesterday and hadn't yet had a chance to interact with one another. The best piece of advice I got as I was starting my research was from a fellow graduate student of mine who had been in the field about 6 months longer than I had. And my first few weeks in Tokyo, as I was searching here and there, spending every day walking the streets trying to find an appropriate place to study, her advice as we sat in a coffee shop was, pick your networks, not your neighborhood. And that sent me back to some of my Japanese friends. And the suggestion that I ended up following was that of a friend of mine who said, that sounds like the neighborhood I grew up in. And my father still lives there, and he's a local leader, and my wife knows a local real estate agent. So through a chain of introductions, we ended up finding an apartment in that neighborhood, my wife and I, and ended up living there for almost 2 years. And
have been back.
And have been back
since then.
Innumerable times
I get the feeling you will continue to go back, whether or not you make a formal restudy. That may come eventually too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the payoff of being an anthropologist, it seems to me, is you make friends, or you hopefully make friends. And having made friends, you don't want to say goodbye to them forever.
Yeah, one of the first things I found out is that I can't locate your community on the map, neither on the English language maps of Tokyo nor on the Japanese language ones. Why study a place that's so uninteresting that even tourists wouldn't want to go there?
Well, in a sense, precisely because of that. What I was interested in studying, and am still interested in, is the daily lives of ordinary Japanese living ordinary lives in ordinary places. As to why you can't find it on a map, I suppose in the time-honored traditions of anthropologists, I've given the neighborhood a pseudonym. I think a Japanese could recognize the neighborhood without ever having to walk through it. What interested me in particular at the very beginning of my research was, in fact, precisely that point, that a Japanese community can exist as a separate, distinct community without any of the kinds of social or racial or ethnic or religious barriers that Westerners tend to think are an essential component of an urban neighborhood. But if I were taking a group of say, foreign tourists through Miyamoto-cho to try and show them something of the texture of social life, I suppose I would show them the local shrine, if we could time it to be there during a festival. That would certainly be a vivid demonstration of the extent to which the neighborhood represents itself as a community. But in the day-to-day passing of events, what would I point out? I'd point out groups of women at a vegetable stall gossiping for half an hour or an hour every night. I'd point out the comings and goings of people to the office of a small construction company where local leaders sort of hang out during the day or during the evening and perhaps have a cup of coffee or a beer and talk over events. I'd point out the grandmothers who scurry out every morning after the garbage trucks come by and sweep up the streets.
Is this different from what you'd find anywhere else, or everywhere else in Tokyo?
I think it is different. It's different to a degree, not different in totality. I often talk to Japanese who've spent a great deal of time in the West or who are essentially upper middle class, who live in very exclusive neighborhoods. And they ask me what I've done research on, and I tell them I've done research on neighborhood associations. And they tend to react by saying, well, that's very interesting. You must be a historian because, of course, we all know that
That's all
neighborhood
in the past.
associations are
Yeah.
pre-war things. And I say, no, there's still a few thousand of them struggling along in neighborhoods across Tokyo. And in fact, if you ask very carefully, you'll find that in almost every neighborhood there's some kind of a neighborhood association. There's some kind of local social organization. I think what differs from neighborhood to neighborhood is the extent to which local participants do or do not feel involved.
Well, in the book you refer to upper and lower. You know, the upper part of the neighborhood as not exclusively, but mainly men commuting to jobs in central Tokyo or elsewhere. And lower as being more the shopkeeper, small business kind of operation. If it's a community, it somehow has some kind of boundaries, even if they're only interactional boundaries. How are those boundaries maintained?
And there exists in the neighborhood a very clearly organized neighborhood association. And that neighborhood association has very clearly drawn boundaries. They can show you almost within a yard, or a meter, I should say, exactly where those run. And the way in which the organization is set up with a neighborhood association that covers the entire neighborhood, and then smaller and smaller units down to clusters of perhaps as few as 5 or 6 households, gives everybody who cares to pay attention a very precise sense of what the institutional boundaries of the neighborhood are.
One of the examples that you give in the book that struck me was that when at the time of the annual festival, when the portable shrine is brought out from the main shrine and carried around, sort of going around marking the boundaries of the community, that if they overstep the boundaries into the next community, then somebody has to go and apologize.
Yeah. I think the accidental misstep into another neighborhood is not likely to require a great apology, but certainly there's one-upsmanship, there's showmanship, there's competition between neighborhoods in the festivals to show that we are a community, therefore we can put on this great festival, or conversely, because we can put on this great festival, it proves we're a community.
About 30 years ago, it seemed as though all those local festivals were kind of dying out. They were still performed, but they were pretty dull. Not many people got involved. Over that 30 years, I've noticed not all, but in many communities, more and more money is being put into them, not just because Japan is more affluent, but somehow that rivalry seems to have regenerated itself. So it looks like little neighborhoods like this are very much alive.
Well, I think they are. I think it's not simply a question of affluence. I think it's a question of a general trend in Japanese society to reevaluate what it means to be Japanese. It's a sense of attaching oneself to a easily recognizable and highly vivid symbol of Japanese culture and saying, hey, look, we as a neighborhood put on this kind of a festival. We as a neighborhood do these kinds of things. You can't get any more traditionally Japanese than that. Therefore, we represent something that the people out in the glossy suburbs, out in Never Never Land, don't represent.
To me, one of the larger lessons coming out of all of this is that in this supposedly homogeneous society, Japanese are always saying we're homogeneous, and Western observers, the media in particular, are always saying they're homogeneous, is that there is enormous locality to locality diversity that's just missing from the American map of Japan. The ways in which Japanese remain able to turn something, eight little blocks in a little shopping street, and say, this is ours. Somehow we're different. Now, an outsider walking through doesn't see that difference, but for them it's real and it's important.
Yeah, it's not, I don't think the question is we're different so much as we're distinct.
Okay.
And there's a subtle difference there, but an important one, I think, in that they are not setting out to prove that what they do, or trying to say that what they do, is different from what other adjacent neighborhoods do,
okay.
but that it's simply theirs, that
Yeah.
we are some kind of a social unit, no better and no worse necessarily than any other social unit, which is kind of refreshing perspective, but simply distinct. And you have to recognize the distinctiveness, the separateness, in a sense, of that community.
When did you first begin to feel, okay, now I know the rules, not know them all, but now I have some sense I can behave in here appropriate to local situations?
Well, that's a tough question. I suppose probably after about a year or so in the neighborhood, I felt reasonably comfortable with knowing the sort of boundaries of social interaction and what I could do and what I shouldn't do, and had sort of adopted a role for myself that everybody seemed comfortable with. But there always are surprises. I mean, something else comes up, and I sometimes, doing research, find myself standing, feeling acutely self-conscious and very awkward, sort of just standing there wondering, what am I supposed to do next? What's the right thing to do? But I think in a sense I've gotten beyond that point, at least in Miyamoto-cho, not while I was doing the research for the book in the early 1980s, but since then, going back on just short visits for an evening when I'm in Tokyo for a short time, and finding that I'm greeted by many of my old friends as simply, oh, you're back. Nobody makes a fuss over my return.
Yeah.
They're sort of happy to see me, but there's not a whole lot of welcoming, there's not a lot of feeling very formal about it. And I think that's when I began to realize that I knew these people well enough and they knew me well enough that we could just relax.
But look, this kind of ethnography,
Right.
very expensive in terms of time. Takes a long, long time. Why spend all that time on a portrait of an 8-block neighborhood? Isn't there some way to get at it quicker?
Well, it's certainly a question one asks oneself as you're in the midst of it, again and again and again. You think, my God, I'm spending an entire afternoon sitting quietly, taking a few notes, asking a few questions, coming back at night with perhaps a page and a half of notes, and thinking this is an awfully slow way to get any information. But I think the quality of the information is different, and I find that the only way to get a sense of what the inner meanings of people's lives are and how they interrelate to one another is by being there, by hanging out, by asking questions, by interviewing people, by observing what they do, by participating as much as possible in their lives.
Ted, can you give me some vignette, some little experience of your own that sort of sums up what it's like to live in Miyamoto-cho?
The kind of thing that sort of sums up life in a place like Miyamoto-cho for me are things like when I was there with my 2.5-year-old son a couple of years ago, just hanging out in a neighbor's driveway on a hot summer evening, everybody sort of standing around in t-shirts and shorts and sandals while the kids played with sparklers. And various mothers would run off to the store and buy a little package of sparklers, and we'd all stand around helping our children wave them, and they were jumping up and down excited. And the parents were standing around chatting, and then somebody said, well, let's go have a beer, and we went off and had a beer. Nothing dramatic, nothing spectacular, nothing to write home about in a sense, but just the kind of friendly, casual, social interaction that goes on. I now live in New York, and I wish there were that kind of
In New York.
interaction in New York. It's ordinary, it's normal for people in Japanese society to want to create ties of belongingness, ties of friendship, ties of mutual interaction with one another. I think it's normal in most societies.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about small town, Midwestern American society. What holds a small town there together? In part, it's friendship. In part, it's feuding. I mean, people need to.
You need partners to feud. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't feud with somebody you don't know well. To say that everybody in Miyamoto-cho likes each other would be ridiculous. But they like knowing each other. I suppose if there's a lesson that urban life doesn't necessarily have to be as alienated and dehumanized as Americans tend to assume it must necessarily be.
Is it because Japanese work harder at it? We're not working hard enough in America at creating these kinds of communities? Is it? Yeah. Is there an easy answer like that?
I don't think there is. I don't think there is an easy answer. I mean, I'm struck. I mean, one of the easy answers, in a sense, not an easy solution, but an easy answer, is that it's easier for Japanese to devote their attentions to creating senses of community because they don't have to devote their attention to drug dealers on the corner, people shooting at each other with submachine guns, and all the other things that, as a New Yorker, I at least read about in the papers every day. Fortunately, I don't experience them every day, but I think it would be a very worthwhile endeavor as an anthropologist to try and do a comparison, say, between New York and Tokyo, and assess the social costs of the kinds of urban problems that Americans put up with in terms of the amount of social energy that can be devoted to other things in other societies. The Japanese have maintained a reasonably livable environment in Tokyo despite all the urban problems, not because they're uniquely Japanese or not because they're working hard or harmonious, but because their society has managed to figure out other ways to deal with problems that plague many Western, particularly American cities. So in a sense, they're free to devote their attention to maintaining a kind of neighborliness that Americans unfortunately can't.
What's the view down here from Miyamoto-cho about life in Tokyo or life in Japan?
Well, the view down here is that Japan is a small island country, poor in natural resources, that people work very hard and don't have a very comfortable life. And that's not the view, certainly, that the mass media portrays in America these days. The view from down here.
Yeah, but they're going for honeymoons in Hawaii.
Yeah, they're not poor, but they don't see themselves as being the masters of the world economy. And in fact, they don't see themselves as particularly connected to many world events. I remember a summer or two ago, sitting in a friend's apartment, or a friend's house, I should say, and his wife, who I've known for, I guess now 15 years, was pouring me a beer, and we were talking about this, that, and the other thing. And suddenly she looked across at me and said, "You know, how come all you foreigners are here?" And I went, "Excuse me?" She said, "Well, I don't mean you. You live here. You've been around here for a long time. We know you. You're a researcher. You write books about Japan and so forth. We can understand you. What I don't understand is, why are there all of these foreigners working in Japan? Why are there foreign businessmen here? Why are there workers from Southeast Asia in Japan?" And I tried to sort of explain that well, Japan was, after all, a world economic center, and it was only natural that bankers and investment people and people in finance and manufacturing and marketing and so forth would come to Tokyo to work on those trade relations, and that Southeast Asians would be drawn to Japan by the opportunity for work. And she looked at me and thought a little while and said, well, you just mean people can't find work in their own countries. And once they can find work in their own countries, they'll go home, right? And I said, no, I don't think so. I think that, like it or not, you're living in a Tokyo that is going to increasingly change and is increasingly going to be pulled into world events. And I think that's the kind of thing that, in a neighborhood like this, most people don't think about. The field of vision of Tokyo as a whole, let alone Japan and the rest of the world, is very, very narrow for many people.
Okay, but two questions pop into mind
Okay.
right away then. Are you implying, for one thing, there really are a bunch of isolated villagers? One possibility. Are you implying, perhaps, they really feel oppressed by the power structure up here in downtown Tokyo where all the political and economic control is?
These people are not isolated from Japanese society as a whole. I think they represent a fundamental national parochialism in a sense. So they're part of the mainstream of Japanese society. The other part of your question is an interesting one. In particular, do they feel oppressed by, are they the downtrodden masses? No, they don't feel oppressed, I don't think, by and large. But
the power is up there.
Oh,
really.
yeah, there's no question that the power is up there, and they don't consider themselves to be particularly powerful people in and of their own right. I think what they see is that they're more influenced by mass media and the sense in which they see the cultural weight of Japan shifting away from their way of life to some idealized suburban household as portrayed in a television commercial where an entire house is nothing but white walls, white floors, flowing curtains, a garden, people
one-touch fuzzy appliances.
And so they see the cultural balance as shifting away from their rather old-fashioned, even to themselves, self-consciously old-fashioned way of life, to some new version which they don't fully understand, and they certainly don't feel that it's their life that they're seeing portrayed back to them as the standard, average, middle-class, urban Japanese household.
Let me ask about what you think the future may hold, because I see two big changes that are happening well underway already. One is the enormous rise in land prices. In effect, within 30 minutes of central Tokyo, almost all usable land, except maybe a few places like Miyamoto-cho, has already been bought up. And that while the community may still be there today, it looks like the realtors are going to take it over and the high-rise developers are going to, in effect, in 10 years you may not even be able to find Miyamoto-cho yourself anymore. Another problem that I see has been all of the now external pressure from the rest of the world to open up that Japanese market and get rid of all these quote-unquote inefficient small distributors and retailers. And can Miyamoto-cho survive that double whammy coming at it, both domestically and
well, for my
overseas?
own personal selfish reasons, I certainly hope so. A lot of my friends live there, and I'd be very sad to think it would all disappear in the next 5 or 10 years. I don't think it's as easy as it seems for real estate developers to take over a neighborhood anymore. In part because land is so fragmented. To buy up parcels of land is not an easy thing to do. So I think what's more likely to happen in a neighborhood like Miyamoto-cho and many other neighborhoods throughout Tokyo is not that super gigantic high-rise condominiums are going to come in, but rather that local homeowners, local businessmen will build medium-sized apartment buildings on a very small piece of land. And the other part of your question, I suppose, is what will the Structural Impediments Initiative do to the small businesses of Tokyo is a harder one to answer. I think that American businessmen, American trade officials have tended to overstate the extent to which they expect the Japanese government to be able to change things overnight. Americans have bought into the idea that Japan Incorporated really exists in ways that are unrealistic in terms of expecting changes. Somebody in the middle of Tokyo here at the Ministry of International Trade and Industry can't simply pick up a phone and tell these guys down here to go out of business
Yeah.
any more than the Secretary of Agriculture in the United States could say to Illinois farmers, sorry, we think the family farm is a thing of the past. Consolidate, please. It's just politically and socially unrealistic to expect that. Certainly small businesses in Tokyo, like many of the ones in Miyamoto-cho, suffer from competition with larger firms, larger supermarkets and so forth. But the competition isn't always one-sided. When my wife and I and our child went back to live in Miyamoto-cho about 2 years ago, the big news in the neighborhood was that a supermarket had just opened up on the shopping street. And it wasn't a very big supermarket by American standards, but it was a reasonable-sized supermarket by Tokyo standards. And one of the first things I did was ask people around there what the effect was. And people were divided. Housewives liked it, better shopping. Shopkeepers who dealt in fresh foods and vegetables and things like that didn't like it because it hurt. Sure. People who dealt in products that the supermarket didn't deal in, like the liquor store across the street, thought it was just great. A supermarket brought more customers.
Sure.
But interestingly, I went back to that neighborhood, a year or so ago, just on a quick visit. The supermarket had gone bankrupt. Couldn't pay the rent. Couldn't pay the high rental fees of that new building it was in. And again, some people are sorry to see it go, some people are happy. So the idea that big business coming in is necessarily going to drive small businesses out is inaccurate. And one of the strengths of small businesses is that they can be very versatile in ways that enable a small business to survive right next to a giant. And I think that's going to happen more than American trade officials think.
Next time I'm going to visit you in your New York neighborhood.
Well, I certainly hope you will.
I'm glad I had a chance to visit you at least verbally in Miyamoto-cho. Thanks very much, Ted.
Thank you.